Welcome to Torn, the only podcast committed to exposing the truth about the child welfare system and its devastating impact on families of color. Told from the perspective of your hosts, Sonia Johnson and Classie Collinette, two defense attorneys who have over 15 years of experience working in the child welfare system.
Well, thank you, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Torn. You're here with your hosts, myself, Classie Collinette, as well as Sonia Johnson. And I am going to first introduce myself, and then I'll turn it over to Sonia. And Sonia will also bring us into the next piece of our episode, which is we are going to have a very special guest today. We have Dr. Brown, and he also will introduce himself. So I'm Classie Collinette. Everyone who has listened to me before, you know that I am a social justice warrior. I have been advocating on behalf of Black, Latino, and poor families in the child welfare system for over a decade. This work is very important to me, and I consider myself a social engineer. I'm always looking for ways to help and support Black, Latino, as well as poor communities. And I will now turn it over to my co-host, Sonia Johnson.
Thank you for that, Classie. I'm Sonia Johnson. I have been an attorney for a number of years. I've been focused on child welfare work for the past 7 years. I am dedicated to overhauling the current child welfare system. And so I am putting on my social justice advocate hat to do that, to move us in a direction of abolishing the current child welfare system because of the devastating impact that it has on Black and Brown families. And we have on our podcast today a very special guest. I'm going to give him the opportunity to introduce himself, but he is going to provide some information about psychological evaluations and how they're used in child welfare, specifically how they're used to destroy Black families. And I've had the pleasure of working with him on a number of my cases, and his critique of psychological evaluations offered by the state have been tremendous and have afforded me the opportunity to really be able to cross-examine and really challenge the state's position with regards to their prosecution of cases against my client. And so with that, Classie, can you just introduce our guest today?
And Dr. Brown, could you tell our listeners who you are, what you do, and perhaps another reason why you are part of this fight for racial justice?
Yes, thank you for having me. I am Andrew Brown. I have a doctorate degree in the field of psychology, which I obtained from Howard University in 1989. My specialty is in the field of neuropsychology. I am trained in the field of neuropsychology, and I have been providing services for the public defender, the Office of Parental Defense for over a decade now.
Dr. Brown, can you just tell us what is the difference between clinical evaluations and forensic evaluations? I know we see both in the area of child welfare, but if you could help us break that down.
Yes. The forensic evaluation is basically a clinical evaluation, but it is the application of a clinical evaluation to the legal system, to the court of law.
Am I correct though, that a clinical evaluation is one where the psychologist is providing recommendations in terms of how to address an underlying mental health issue, and then the forensic seeks to address a legal question? Is that correct?
Yes, that would be correct. So the forensic requires much more, I would say, it's much more stringent than a clinical evaluation because with a clinical evaluation, it could be to determine the best course of treatment or therapy for a client. It could be for something along the lines of determining whether or not a client is suffering from a mental disorder, or if they are, how that disorder is impacting on their ability to function. Whereas with a forensic evaluation, it requires that the measures and the tests that are used meet certain standards, and they have to be appropriate.
My follow-up question to that is, should I have the word consumer. I know we're typically referring to families who are subject to the services, whether it's yourself or another psychologist who's evaluating them. But from your vantage point, should a family member, whether it's a mom or dad or another guardian, should they have the same evaluator doing the clinical and the forensic evaluation? And if you could just tell us why, if you could give us the little background on, why you have reached that conclusion.
Well, it would depend on the skill set of the evaluator. Not any psychologist can work in the forensic arena if they're not trained as far as being able to select the appropriate tools that will assist the court.
So, Dr. Brown, just to set the stage, when a parent or guardian is coming in to a meeting with you or another psychologist, understandably, that parent is nervous, they're fearful, they're worried, they're ashamed. These are individuals whose children are sitting in foster care, sometimes in foster care with individuals that they have never met. They don't know what you as the evaluator, right? What are your motives? And
Right.
this is an emotionally loaded experience for the parent or guardian on the other side of the table. So when you first meet a parent or guardian who's coming in for these evaluations, can you tell us what role, if any, from your vantage point, do you play in just bringing them to a place of calm?
Right.
Because a lot of folks, they may not even be able to answer your questions because they're so worried about what I just talked about. So could you tell our listeners what you do?
Exactly. Well, I establish rapport, and that is absolutely critical to establish at the outset of these assessments before the psychologist or the clinician begins administering any tasks or measures. Because if rapport is not established at the outset, then it is a threat to the validity of the assessment. And I can't tell you how many clients I see who, and I ask them as part of establishing that rapport, I ask them, did you see the psychologist or the doctor for the state? And I can't tell you how many times they tell me that they had a bad experience, that the psychologist didn't speak to them, or they felt the psychologist was cold toward them and showed no empathy, or that the psychologist seemed to disregard them. Now, that impacts on that assessment because like you said, they're nervous and anxious to begin with. And now they're taking these tests and trying to answer these questions. And the only thing in their mind is, I want to get out of here. I want to get away from this person. So it can certainly serve as a threat to the validity of the assessment process itself. Failure to establish rapport is critical.
I just wanted to jump in, Dr. Brown, because every evaluation that I have read, the evaluator clearly includes in the report that a rapport was established. But all of us know who work in this area that the power dynamics that are at play, and just as Classie indicated, our parents are really in a vulnerable state.
Absolutely.
And they are trying to perform or trying to ensure that they get it right for the evaluator. And typically the evaluator is someone that does not share their cultural background. So how are we to assess that term in the reports that say, rapport was established?
Yeah, when you ask the client, and that's all I do, I just simply ask the client, how did the assessment go? How do you feel you did? And the first thing they'll tell me is they didn't like this person, or, the doctor didn't say anything to me. I just came in and they just started giving me tests. They didn't speak to me. Or, I was trying to explain to the doctor my involvement with family services, and I didn't feel the doctor was listening to me. I felt disregarded. So, yeah, you get these reports that have these labels, but when you actually speak to the client, there's nothing supporting that label in their description of what took place.
Dr. Brown, can you describe for us how psychologicals are actually used in the area of child welfare?
Well, they are used to assist the court in helping determine whether or not a parent is ready to parent, is psychologically capable of parenting, and whether or not a parent has resolved all of the issues that got them involved with child welfare in the first place. So as a result, they often see the same psychologist multiple times to determine whether or not they've advanced or whether or not they've improved.
So Dr. Brown, let me ask you this. Is there an assessment that answers the question whether a parent can parent?
No. There is no assessment. There is no test that answers that question. There are some measures on the market, and there is one in particular, the AAPI, which has gained a lot of use and is very popular, and it promotes itself as a test that can measure parenting. But, this is a tool, a measure that was rushed to the market ahead of any independent research. And now we see the independent studies coming out, which show that the test lacks validity, that the constructs that this test supposedly measures do not exist.
And I know that you have written reports identifying some of the problems that you just laid out with the AAPI. So when the psychologists that work for the state provide these reports, what is it that they're doing? What can you just describe that process for our listeners who may not completely understand the process?
What typically happens is that a psychologist will interview them, get background information from them, question them about their involvement with child welfare, question them about their children and their relationships with their children. The psychologist will ask them about their developmental history, their family background, their education history, their work history, their residential status. There will be questions about whether or not they've had any legal difficulty in the past, and if so, how much. There'll be questions about whether or not they have a history of substance abuse or substance use. There'll be questions about whether or not they have been previously involved with mental health professionals, whether or not they have ever spent time in a psychiatric hospital, whether or not they've ever had a mental health diagnosis. And then following the interview, the psychologist will typically administer a series of tests. And the testing usually involve personality tests. There may be so-called parenting tests, as the one just mentioned. Psychologists may administer a measure of intelligence. There may be an additional parenting measure to determine whether or not a client shows any potential for physical child abuse. And I'm thinking of another measure that may be administered as well that determines the presence or absence of stress in the relationship between the parent and the child.
Dr. Brown, as you know, in the fall of 2020, there was an apology letter that was issued by the American Psychological Association. Could you tell us a little bit about what that apology letter included and what were some major highlights from that apology letter?
Yes, this was monumental, and it came as a very pleasant surprise to me. This was administered, or released rather, in October 2021. And the apology letter was specifically to people of color for the American Psychological Association's role in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism, racial discrimination, and the human hierarchy in the United States. And the very first paragraph of this apology resolution states that the American Psychological Association failed in its role leading the discipline of psychology, was complicit in contributing to systemic inequities, and hurt many through racism, racial discrimination, and denigration of people of color, thereby falling short on its mission to benefit society and improve lives. Now, this is huge.
Wow. I don't want to interrupt you, but that is huge. And I remember when we learned about that, and we had a CLE last year as well. And Classie and I first learned about the apology letter in that CLE, and it was huge. So I'm sorry, I just had to express my reaction then and now to the apology letter. So I'm sorry about that, Dr. Brown.
No, I was just going to say some of the other points that were huge here. They state and acknowledge that psychologists have created and promoted the widespread application of psychological tests and instruments that have been used to disadvantage many communities of color. That psychologists have contributed to the overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, and lack of culturally appropriate diagnostic criteria to characterize the lived experiences and mental health concerns of people of color. They also state, the resolution also states that psychology has been complicit in failing to effectively elevate the science behind the disproportionate concentration of adverse social determinants of health in communities of color. And so the resolution resolves, and this is important. This is the ball of wax right here. Reaffirms that race is a social construct with no underlying genetic or biological basis, and debunks the notion that different groups can be ranked hierarchically on the basis of physical characteristics. And here we're talking about skin color.
So, Dr. Brown, I just want to jump in because we talked a lot early on about the importance of building rapport. And so you're highlighting this apology letter that was issued in the fall of 2021. And again, we're circling back to this construct of race. can you tell us a little bit about what's the interplay between race? And I know you already indicated earlier that you've also witnessed racism in the way evaluations have been conducted. So could you tell us a little bit about the interplay between the social construct of race, as well as the racial makeup of the field of psychologists?
Yes.
Right? So the folks who are generally evaluating families that are involved in the child welfare system, what's the interplay between those two things? The race of the psychologist and this race of, which is often Black families or Latino families. And depending on what county you're in, you may also see some poor white families. But by and large, we're talking about Black and Latino families. So could you tell us what's the interplay between those two things, race of the parent or guardian and race of the psychologist?
Well, that's a lot.
So, let me break it down a little bit more for you. Okay. What role does race play? Let me just say it this way. What role does race play in these evaluations? You talked about the difference between clinical and forensic. Can you tell our listeners what is the role of race, especially in light of this apology letter that was issued?
Well, let's talk about, yes, let's do that. And let me just back up, if I may, on the apology and what it means. And if I could just for a second, and I think I'll segue into the whole role of what race plays here. The APA apology is a formal step in acknowledging psychology's role in perpetuating, promulgating, and failing to challenge the racial hierarchy and its corresponding racism and discrimination in the United States. It is the formal acknowledgement that psychology has been complicit in contributing to systemic racial inequities. It acknowledges that the discipline of psychology cannot heal without addressing the damage done by colonialism, which has created the forces in society that cause the wounds that persist to the present day. In order for the discipline of psychology to be effective, it must address the sustained forces that have caused the wounds which psychologists both assess and treat. So when we talk about the interplay of race and psychology, we have to understand how psychology has been practiced and applied since its inception. What psychology did for many years, and the reason why we have this formal apology, is that psychology was complicit in supporting this racial hierarchy, because all of the tests and the measures center whiteness as the norm. So when these tests are administered to diverse groups or ethnically diverse populations, the comparative norm that is used to determine the presence or absence of psychopathology or mental health disorder or personality disorder, or in the current topic, ability to parent, is white middle class.
So if I could just interject, Dr. Brown. So what you're saying is the current assessments that are being used center whiteness? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. They center whiteness. They center a middle-class white lifestyle. The assessment tools that are being used are not sensitive to differences in ethnicity and culture.
The opinions and views expressed on this podcast are those of its hosts and guests and represent our own lived experience. The views and opinions expressed do not reflect those of any agency or organization with which we may be associated.